Most people think the story of Rome begins in Rome. It doesn't. It begins about 25 kilometers away, in a city called Alba Longa, sometime around 771 BC, with a palace coup, a forced retirement, and a young woman who was never supposed to have children. A founding built on betrayal. King Numitor of Alba Longa had barely settled into his reign when his younger brother Amulus shoved him aside and took the throne. To make sure no heir would ever challenge him, Amulus had Numitor's sons killed. His daughter, Silvia, he spared, but not out of mercy. Instead, she was made a Vestal virgin, a priestess bound by sacred law never to bear children. It was a clean, bloodless solution, and for a while, it worked. Then Silvia turned up pregnant. Her explanation, that the god of war, Mars, had fathered her children, was met with exactly the kind of skepticism you'd expect. But whether anyone believed her or not, the problem was now very real. Twin boys, Romulus and Remus, had been born, and their existence threatened everything Amulus had built. His answer was simple. He had the infants placed in a basket and set adrift on the Tiber River. The basket didn't sink. It washed up on a muddy bank. And from the tree line, a she-wolf emerged. Rather than harm the boys, she nursed them. A shepherd eventually found them, took them in, and raised them as his own. Those two boys would grow into something their great-uncle should have feared far more than he did. The brothers who couldn't share. Years later, Romulus and Remus were tall, strong, and looking for trouble. After a brawl with some of King Amulus's men, the truth came out. They weren't forest-born nobodies, they were the rightful heirs of Alba Longa. They marched back to the city, rallied the people, overthrew their great-uncle, and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne. It was a storybook comeback. But Romulus and Remus had developed a taste for power, and sitting quietly in their grandfather's court wasn't exactly their style. They decided to build a city of their own, a few kilometers away along the banks of the Tiber River. 7 hills, beautiful scenery, good farmland, perfect. The only thing they couldn't agree on was where, exactly, to build it. Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill. Remus insisted on the Aventine. Neither would yield, so they did what ancient people did when logic failed. They asked the gods. The method was simple. Whoever spotted more birds in the sky had divine favor on their side. Remus saw 6. Romulus claimed 12. The argument that followed was loud, petty, and terminal. Romulus began building his wall anyway. Remus, in a final act of mockery, leapt over it, a gesture meant to show how laughably small and useless it was. Romulus killed him. Whether it was rage, cold calculation, or both, no one knows. What we do know is that when Romulus founded his city in 753 BC, he named it after himself, and the price of its founding was his brother's blood. A city built from the bottom up. The new city had walls, hills, and a king, but almost no people. To fill it, Romulus declared Rome an open asylum. Runaway slaves, exiles, debtors, fugitives. Anyone on the wrong side of the law somewhere else was welcome here. The result was a population that was male, desperate, and entirely without women. This was a problem. Romulus's solution was both clever and appalling. He invited the neighboring Sabine people to a grand festival, music, food, celebration. When the festivities were at their peak, Roman men seized the Sabine women and refused to let them leave. The Sabine men, understandably furious, attacked. What followed was Rome's first war, fought just 3 years after its founding. It ended not with a military victory but with the Sabine women themselves walking between the two armies and demanding peace. Merge the kingdoms, they said, stop being stupid. Both sides listened. The Sabines and Romans became one people. And Rome gained something it desperately needed, a future. Over the next 2 centuries, 6 more kings ruled Rome in succession. Some were builders, some were warriors, some were deeply pious, and at least one managed to anger a god badly enough to die for it. The final king was a tyrant so cruel and so reckless that the Roman people simply expelled him from the city and refused to let another king take his place. They had tried monarchy. It hadn't gone well. The republic and the hunger for revenge. What replaced the kingdom was, in theory, something far more balanced, the Roman Republic. Instead of one king, Rome would be governed by 2 elected consuls, each with the power to veto the other. Each serving for a single year. No single man would ever dominate again. That was the idea. The reality, for a while, was chaos. Not long after the Republic was established, the Gauls swept down from what is now France, defeated the Roman army, entered the city, burned most of it to the ground, and sat around for months eating and looting before accepting a ransom of gold and strolling back north. Rome never forgot it. That humiliation became the fuel for something almost terrifying in its intensity. The Romans turned themselves into one of the most relentlessly militaristic societies the ancient world had ever seen. Over the following centuries, they absorbed their Latin neighbors, crushed the hill tribes, swallowed the Greek colonies of southern Italy, and kept going, because stopping felt like it might let the next enemy catch up. The most serious challenge came from across the Mediterranean. Carthage, wealthy, powerful, with a navy that dominated the sea and a treasury deeper than Rome's imagination, was simply too close and too strong to be tolerated. The two powers fought 3 wars across a century, known as the Punic Wars, and each one was bigger and bloodier than the last. In the first, Rome built a navy essentially from scratch, copying a captured Carthaginian vessel, and won control of Sicily. In the second, the Carthaginian general Hannibal crossed the Alps with 50,000 soldiers and 37 war elephants in one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. Then spent years tearing through Italy while Rome scrambled to survive. Rome outlasted him, as Rome tended to do. And in the Third War, Rome stopped outlasting and simply ended Carthage entirely, razed the city, salted the earth, and enslaved the survivors. With its only real rival gone, the Republic turned its attention outward in every direction. Spain, Greece, North Africa, Turkey, and finally, with particular satisfaction, the land of the Gauls. The man who delivered that final blow was Julius Caesar. Caesar marched into Gaul with a relatively modest army and proceeded to dismantle it piece by piece, defeating tribe after tribe. Pushing into what is now Belgium, crossing into Germany, and even making a brief, curious landing in Britain just to see what was there. When he returned to Rome, he was so powerful, so celebrated, and so clearly dangerous that the Senate panicked. They ordered him to come to the city alone, without his army. He crossed the Rubicon River with his legions instead, and the Senate fled before him. What followed was years of civil war across the Mediterranean world. Caesar defeated his rivals, had a famous affair with Cleopatra in Egypt, and eventually stood as the undisputed master of the Roman Republic, a republic that, in his hands, was already ceasing to be one. He was not simply a conqueror. Caesar genuinely reformed Rome's institutions. He fixed the chaotic Roman calendar, creating something close to the 365-day year we still use today. And lending his name to the month of July. He reduced taxes, cancelled debts, extended citizenship to people who had long been excluded, rebuilt large sections of the city, and regulated the grain supply so that the urban poor could actually eat. But he was also accumulating power at a rate the Senate found impossible to ignore. Dictator, consul, chief priest, he collected political offices the way others collected debts. To men who had spent 500 years guarding against the return of monarchy. It looked exactly like a king in the making. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, a group of senators surrounded Caesar during a meeting and stabbed him 23 times. They walked out believing they had saved the Republic. The Roman people, who had genuinely loved Caesar, had a rather different reaction. The liberators had murdered the man who lowered their taxes and fed their families. What they had actually saved was anyone's guess, but it wasn't the Republic. The birth of an empire. Into the power vacuum left by Caesar's death stepped 2 main contenders. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally and a man of enormous ambition, and Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted great-nephew, who looked harmless and was anything but. For a time they cooperated, dividing Rome's world between them. But cooperation between 2 people who both want everything rarely lasts. Antony's growing attachment to Cleopatra in Egypt, the gifts, the alliance, the rumored plan to move the empire's capital to Alexandria, gave Octavian the pretext he needed. Whether the threat was real is doubtful. Whether Rome believed it is all that mattered. Octavian went to war. 1. And watched as Antony and Cleopatra both took their own lives rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. He was now the last man standing. Octavian was too clever to call himself king. Instead, he called himself princeps, first citizen, and allowed the Senate to give him the honorific name Augustus. The word meant something close to the revered one. On January 16, 27 BC, the Roman Empire was officially born, wearing the polite fiction of a restored republic like a well-fitted mask. Augustus and the art of making things last. What made Augustus extraordinary was not ambition. Rome had no shortage of ambitious men. What made him extraordinary was patience, and the rare ability to think not about winning, but about endurance. He understood, with surgical clarity, why the Republic had destroyed itself. It wasn't ideology. It wasn't corruption. It was the army. For a century, Roman soldiers had fought for generals, for Marius, for Sulla, for Caesar, not for Rome itself. When your army's loyalty belongs to a man rather than a state, every successful general is a potential coup. Augustus severed that connection systematically. He turned the Roman military into a professional standing force. Soldiers enlisted for 20 years, received a fixed salary from the state, and were guaranteed land grants from the government upon retirement, not from their commanding general. Loyalty now flowed upward to Rome, not sideways to individual commanders. He also separated military power from economic power across the provinces, rotated generals before they could build personal fiefdoms, and maintained roughly 25 to 30 legions, around 150,000 soldiers, permanently stationed across the empire. He also changed Rome's fundamental strategic posture. The age of endless expansion was over. Pacifying Spain, securing the Alps, hardening the Danube frontier, the goal now was to consolidate what Rome had, not to keep reaching for more. That policy was tested almost immediately. The forest that stopped an empire. In 9 AD, a Roman general named Varus led 3 legions into the forests of Germania on what he believed was a routine administrative mission. His guide and trusted advisor was Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had grown up around Romans, served in the Roman army, and earned every honor they had given him. He had also decided, quietly and carefully, that his people were running out of time. To Arminius, Roman civilization wasn't order, it was erasure. Roman courts replacing tribal customs, Roman law overriding local authority, Roman taxes, Roman expectations, Roman assumptions that everyone, eventually, would want to become Roman. He understood that once that process finished, resistance would be impossible. So he waited, maintained his Roman facade, and when the moment came, he led Varus's legions deep into the Teutoburg forest, narrow paths, dense trees, no room for formations, no way to use the discipline and equipment that made Roman soldiers so devastating in open ground. For 3 days, Germanic warriors struck from the trees and melted back into the forest. Units lost contact with each other. Officers were cut down. The army, stretched for kilometers along narrow trails, came apart piece by piece. More than 20,000 professional Roman soldiers died. Varus took his own life. The legions, numbered 17, 18, and 19, were never reconstituted. Those numbers were simply retired, as if Rome couldn't bear to see them again. Augustus reportedly paced his palace afterward, banging his head against the walls, crying out for Varus to give him back his legions. The Rhine became the permanent frontier. Rome never seriously attempted to conquer Germania again. A man who knew Rome from the inside had beaten it from the outside. And the wound never fully healed. The Golden Age and its contradictions. Augustus died in 14 AD. Having ruled for over 40 years, he left behind something Rome had not known in a century: stability. The institutions he built, the professional army, the provincial system, the careful separation of power, gave the empire a foundation strong enough to carry it forward. For a Roman citizen living inside that empire, especially in Italy or one of the major provinces, the quality of life was genuinely remarkable by ancient standards. Paved roads connected cities across thousands of kilometers. Aqueducts brought clean water from distant mountains. Public baths, Grain distributions, courts, and written laws gave daily life a structure that simply didn't exist anywhere else in the world at that time. Outside the empire, life was harder and less predictable. Rural, decentralized, without standing armies or permanent infrastructure. People outside Rome's borders often didn't want to destroy it, they wanted access to what it offered. That desire to get in, rather than to tear it down, would shape the final chapters of Rome's story. For now, though, the empire was at its height, and the wheel of succession was turning. The long procession of emperors. After Augustus, Rome cycled through emperors the way other empires cycled through fashions, some brilliant, most mediocre, several catastrophic. Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son, was capable but deeply introverted, suspicious of everyone, and so uncomfortable with public life that he eventually abandoned Rome entirely and governed the empire from the island of Capri. This left a dangerous vacuum in the capital, which the Praetorian Guard, Augustus's elite palace security force, moved swiftly to fill. With the emperor absent, whoever commanded the guard effectively controlled access to power. It was in this climate, in the distant province of Judea, that a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth was arrested by local authorities and handed to the Roman administration. He was executed for causing unrest. To Rome, it was a minor provincial matter, barely worth recording. The empire moved on. Caligula came next, selected by the Praetorian Guard, and initially promising. His reign deteriorated quickly. The solution, once the guard decided he had become a liability, was straightforward. They killed him in a palace corridor and immediately declared his uncle Claudius the new emperor. Rome had now crossed a line it could never uncross. The emperor was no longer chosen by tradition or law or even popular legitimacy. He was chosen by the soldiers standing closest to the throne. Claudius proved more competent than his dramatic appointment suggested, expanding the empire and strengthening administration. His successor, Nero, did not, obsessed with his public image, careless with money, presiding over fires, rebellions, and financial collapse. Nero managed to lose the confidence of the Senate, the army, and finally the Praetorian Guard. He fled Rome and took his own life in 68 AD. His death triggered the Year of the Four Emperors, 69 AD. One of the most chaotic 12 months in Roman history. 4 men claimed the throne in succession. Legions that should have been defending the borders were instead marching on each other. One emperor was murdered. Another lasted barely 3 months. Civil war burned through the empire's western provinces. Vespasian eventually emerged victorious, not because he was particularly charismatic or beloved, but because he commanded the most reliable army. He restored order, handed the empire to his sons, and in doing so taught every future emperor the same lesson. In Rome, military loyalty was the only currency that ultimately mattered. By 117 AD, under the Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, encompassing what is now Romania, Jordan, Armenia, and virtually everything in between. It was the high water mark. From here, the tide would very slowly, then very suddenly, begin to recede. The 3rd century and the beginning of the end. The 3rd century was, by any measure, a catastrophe. Emperors came and went with terrifying speed, most of them dying violently within months of taking power. The empire very nearly fractured into separate states. Germanic tribes hammered the western frontiers. Persian armies pressed hard from the east. Massive plagues swept through cities. Hyperinflation destroyed the economy as desperate emperors debased the currency to pay their soldiers. Rome's response, eventually, was structural. The empire was simply too large and too complex to be governed from a single center. A bold emperor made the radical decision to divide it, creating a system of 4 co-rulers, 2 senior, 2 junior, each responsible for a different region, each living near the frontiers rather than in distant comfort. Rome itself, for the first time, was quietly abandoned as a seat of power. Constantine won the final civil war that followed, reunited the empire under his rule, and made 2 decisions that would echo for 1,000 years. The first was to embrace Christianity, transforming it from a persecuted minority faith into the empire's official religion. The second was to build a new capital. In 330 AD, he founded Constantinople on the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, strategically brilliant, economically rich, and far easier to defend than Rome. The center of gravity of the Roman world shifted east, permanently. The western half of the empire, left behind, became something close to a ghost of its former self, increasingly poor, increasingly reliant on foreign soldiers, increasingly unable to hold its own borders. The fall. The final chapter began not with an invasion, but with a catastrophe on the northern frontier. The Huns, a nomadic confederation from the Eurasian steppe, erupted westward in the late 4th century with a ferocity that sent shockwaves across the entire barbarian world. When they crashed into the Goths living north of the Danube, the Goths made a very rational decision: they ran. They ran to Rome. Tens of thousands of Goths massed on the Danube's southern bank, asking for asylum. Rome let them in, partly out of humanitarian instinct, partly because desperate men make good soldiers. On paper, it was manageable. In practice, Roman officials exploited and starved the Gothic refugees so badly that they revolted. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, a Roman army was annihilated and the emperor himself was killed in battle, by people Rome had just allowed inside its own borders. The lesson Rome had failed to learn was now written in blood. Bring in a whole people. Failed to integrate them honestly. And you haven't solved your problem. You've relocated it inside your walls. The Western Empire spent its remaining decades making deals it couldn't enforce. Land was offered to armed groups in exchange for peace. The peace never held. The Vandals swept through Spain and crossed into North Africa, stripping away the grain and tax revenue that the entire Western military machine depended on. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD. The city that had once seemed eternal was looted by people who had been living inside Roman territory for decades. The Western Empire limped on for another 60 years, mostly governed by the military commanders who actually held power, while a series of increasingly powerless emperors lent the proceedings a fading air of legitimacy. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer politely informed the last emperor, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, whose name carried, in its two halves, both the founder of Rome and its first emperor, that his services were no longer required. There was no final battle, no heroic last stand, just a quiet administrative decision, and then silence. What remained? It would be misleading to say Rome simply ended in 476. The eastern half, richer, better defended, more culturally cohesive, continued for nearly 1,000 years more. We call it the Byzantine Empire today. Though its inhabitants called themselves Romans until the very end, they fought fiercely and intelligently to survive, holding back Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders across the centuries. But territory fell, decade by decade, until only the city of Constantinople remained. In 1453, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the ancient walls. The city fell after a siege, and the last emperor died fighting on the ramparts. The Cathedral of Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The Roman Empire, in whatever form you choose to trace it, was finally, undeniably over. Rome lasted, in one form or another, for over 2,000 years. It began with a mythological fratricide on a muddy Italian hillside and ended with a siege on the Bosphorus. In between, it gave the world its calendar, its legal traditions, its roads, its architectural language, its concept of citizenship, and the organizational blueprint for nearly every large state that followed. It was not always just. It was not always wise. It enslaved millions, destroyed civilizations, and collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But no other human institution has ever left a mark so deep, so wide, or so lasting. All roads led to Rome, and in some sense, many still do.